Jake Carter wiped the grease off his hands and looked at the old pickup truck he'd just finished working on. Another day, another repair job in his small garage on the outskirts of Reno. The sun was setting over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He locked up the shop and decided to take his motorcycle for a ride through the back roads, something he did when he needed to clear his head. The desert stretched out endlessly on both sides of the empty highway. Jake loved this feeling of freedom, just him and the open road. But about 20 miles out, something caught his eye. A strange glow in the distance, pulsing with an eerie blue light. At first, he thought maybe it was some kids messing around with flares or maybe a crashed plane. His instincts told him to check it out. He pulled off the main road and rode across the rough desert terrain toward the light. As he got closer, his heart started pounding. This wasn't any plane he'd ever seen. The object was massive, maybe 50 feet long, with a sleek metallic surface that seemed to shimmer even in the fading light. Parts of it were scorched black, and there was a long trench in the sand where it had clearly crash-landed. Jake killed the engine and approached carefully. The craft was making strange humming sounds, and panels along its sides sparked occasionally. He'd worked on every type of engine imaginable, but this was something else entirely. Still, his curiosity got the better of him. He noticed what looked like a door or hatch, partially open and leaking some kind of vapor. He pulled the hatch wider and climbed inside. The interior was dimly lit by flickering lights, and the air had a strange metallic smell. That's when he saw her. A woman, or at least something that looked mostly human, slumped against what appeared to be a control panel. She had pale skin with faint silver markings along her arms, and her clothing looked like it was made from materials that didn't exist on Earth. She was breathing but barely. Her eyes flickered open when she heard him approach. They were an unusual violet color, filled with pain and fear. She tried to speak, but the words came out in a language Jake couldn't understand. Then suddenly, a device on her wrist glowed, and her next words came out in perfect English, though her voice was weak. "Please, help me. My ship, the life support is failing. I don't have much time." Jake looked around the ship's interior. Despite the alien technology, he could recognize the basics. There were conduits that looked like they carried power, panels that seemed to monitor different systems, and a central unit that was clearly struggling to function. Sparks flew from a damaged section, and the temperature inside was dropping fast. Okay, just stay calm," Jake said, his mind already working through possibilities. "I'm a mechanic. Let me see what I can do." The woman, who introduced herself as Lyra through labored breaths, explained that her ship had been sabotaged. Someone had damaged critical systems before she could escape. She was a princess, she said, though Jake wasn't sure he believed that part. Right now it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was dying, and this ship was her only chance. Jake ran back to his motorcycle and grabbed his toolkit. It wasn't much, just basic equipment, but it was all he had. He returned to the ship and started examining the life support system. The technology was completely foreign, but the principles were universal. Power needed to flow, circuits needed to complete, and cooling systems needed to work. He identified the main problem. A damaged power regulator was causing the system to fail. The alien components were fried beyond repair, but Jake had an idea. He pulled out an alternator from his toolkit, something he'd grabbed from an old car earlier that week. It wasn't designed for this, not even close, but the voltage output was similar. Working quickly, he bypassed the alien regulator and wired in the alternator using cables from the ship itself. Lyra watched in amazement as this human used primitive Earth technology to solve a problem that Valerian engineers would have said was impossible. The systems weren't compatible. The power signatures were wrong. It shouldn't work. But Jake didn't care about what should or shouldn't work. He cared about making it work. He twisted wires together, rerouted power flows, and used duct tape in places where alien fasteners had failed. It was crude, it was inelegant, but after 30 minutes of frantic work, the life support system hummed back to life. Warm air began flowing through the ship again. The lights stabilized. Lyra took a deep breath as oxygen returned to normal levels. She stared at Jake with a mixture of disbelief and respect. "You actually did it," she whispered. "Our engineers said human technology was too primitive. But you just saved my life with parts from your world." Jake shrugged, wiping sweat from his forehead. Sometimes the best solution isn't the fancy one. It's the one that works. Over the next 3 days, Jake's small garage became the most unlikely repair shop in the galaxy. Lyra's ship was too damaged to fly properly, but the real problem was the faster-than-light drive. Without it, she was stranded millions of miles from her home. Jake had moved the ship under cover of night to his property, hiding it behind his garage under old tarps and scrap metal. The last thing he needed was the government or military showing up asking questions. Lyra managed to send a distress signal to her people using the ship's communication array. The response came back within hours, but the news wasn't good. Her father, the Emperor, was sending a rescue fleet, but they were currently engaged in border conflicts on the other side of their territory. The fastest they could reach Earth was 4 to 6 weeks. Lyra's face fell when she heard this. She explained to Jake that the political situation back home was unstable. Her enemies, the ones who sabotaged her ship, would use her absence to consolidate power. "I need to get home sooner," she said, frustration evident in her voice. "Every day I'm gone, they grow stronger." Jake looked at the massive FTL drive core sitting in the center of her ship. It was the size of a small car, covered in crystalline structures and exotic metals he'd never seen before. According to Lyra, the drive worked by folding space itself, creating a bubble that allowed the ship to travel faster than light. The sabotage had cracked the main crystal matrix and destroyed several control nodes. Without proper Valerian replacement parts, it was supposedly impossible to repair. "Let me take a look at it," Jake said, rolling up his sleeves. Lyra shook her head. "You don't understand. This technology took my people centuries to develop. It requires precise calibration and materials that don't exist on your world. Even our best engineers need specialized facilities to repair these drives." "Maybe," Jake said, already examining the damaged components. "But I didn't fix your life support with Valerian parts, did I?" He spent the first day just trying to understand how the thing worked. Lyra explained the principles as best she could, though much of it went over his head. Something about quantum tunneling, subspace fields, and crystalline resonance matrices. But Jake had learned long ago that you didn't need to understand the physics to fix something. You just needed to understand what each part did and how they connected. He started making trips to junkyards and electronics stores, buying up anything that might be useful. Old computer parts, industrial magnets, copper wire, even some quartz crystals he found at a rock shop. Lyra watched in confusion as he hauled box after box of Earth technology into the garage. "What are you planning to do with all this?" she asked. "Fix your drive," Jake said simply. "With these primitive components? It's impossible." Jake grinned. "You said that about the life support too." He worked 18-hour days, stopping only to eat and catch a few hours of sleep. Lyra stayed by his side, initially to explain the ship's systems, but gradually she found herself fascinated by his approach. Valerian engineers followed strict protocols and procedures. Everything had to be done by the manual, using approved parts and methods. Jake threw all of that out the window. When the crystalline matrix needed to resonate at a specific frequency, Jake rigged up a system using modified radio transmitters and oscillators from old ham radios. When the control nodes needed replacing, he built new ones from circuit boards, carefully soldering components based on the energy patterns Lyra described. He didn't have the right materials, so he made do with what he had, compensating for differences through clever design. Lyra watched him troubleshoot a particularly stubborn power coupling problem at 2 in the morning. He'd been at it for 6 hours straight, his hands covered in grease and minor burns from hot solder. Most people would have given up, would have accepted that some things were just impossible. But Jake kept going, trying one approach after another, learning from each failure. "Why do you keep trying?" Lyra asked quietly. "You barely know me. This isn't even your problem." Jake looked up from his work. "Because you need help and I can give it. That's reason enough." He returned to the coupling. "Besides, I've never backed down from a challenge. And this is one hell of a challenge." There was something admirable about that, Lyra thought. Humans didn't have the advanced technology of her people. They didn't have centuries of accumulated knowledge about space travel. But they had this incredible stubbornness, this refusal to accept limitations. Jake didn't care that Valerian engineers said it was impossible. He just kept working until he found a way. On the 4th day, Jake made the final connection. He'd rebuilt nearly 30% of the FTL drive using Earth technology and sheer determination. The crystalline matrix was held together with a framework of titanium and steel. The control systems ran through modified computer processors. The power regulators were a hybrid of alien and human design that shouldn't work according to any known physics. "Okay," Jake said, exhausted but excited. "Let's fire this thing up and see what happens." Lyra initiated the startup sequence, her hands trembling slightly. The drive began to hum, then glow with that characteristic blue light. Readings appeared on her displays and her eyes went wide. "It's working," she whispered. "By the stars, it's actually working. The drive is at 78% efficiency." Jake wiped his hands on a rag and smiled. 78%? That'll get you home, right? It'll get me home in 3 days instead of 6 weeks, Lyra said, still staring at the readings in disbelief. Jake, do you understand what you've done? You've accomplished something that our finest engineers would say violates the fundamental principles of FTL technology. Yeah, well, Jake said with a tired grin, sometimes you've got to break the rules to get things done. Jake was under the ship checking the modified landing gear when Lyra's warning system started blaring. She rushed to the controls, her face going pale as she read the display. They found me, she said, her voice tight with fear. 2 ships just entered your atmosphere. They're heading straight for us. Jake crawled out from under the ship, grabbing a wrench. Who found you? The same people who sabotaged my ship. They must have tracked the repair signatures. Lyra pulled up a holographic display showing 2 small craft descending rapidly toward their location. They're assassins from House Mordrin. They won't stop until I'm dead. Jake's mind raced. They had maybe 10 minutes before those ships arrived. His garage was in the middle of nowhere, but that also meant no help was coming. It was just the 2 of them against trained alien killers. Can your ship fight? He asked. Lyra shook her head. The weapon systems are completely destroyed. We're defenseless. Maybe your ship is, Jake said, a plan already forming. But we're not. He ran to his storage shed and started pulling out everything he could use. Hunting rifles, a shotgun his grandfather left him, road flares, gasoline cans and fertilizer from his small garden. Lyra watched in confusion as he loaded everything into his pickup truck. What are you doing? Those are primitive weapons. Their ships have energy shields. Yeah, but do they have shields when they land and their people get out? Jake asked. They're coming here to finish the job personally, right? Lyra nodded slowly. They'll want proof of my death. They have to see my body. Then we give them a fight they're not expecting. Jake worked fast. He'd grown up hunting in these deserts and knew the terrain like the back of his hand. He drove the truck half a mile out, positioning it behind a rocky outcropping that gave him a clear view of his garage. Then he started setting up his defenses. He rigged several containers of gasoline with road flares, creating makeshift explosives. He positioned his rifles at different points, preloaded and ready to grab. It wasn't sophisticated, but it didn't need to be. The alien ships landed 15 minutes later, their sleek forms touching down near Jake's garage with barely a sound. Lyra stayed hidden in the rocks beside him, watching through binoculars. 4 figures emerged from the ships, wearing dark armor that seemed to absorb light. They carried weapons that glowed with an ominous red energy. Those are plasma rifles, Lyra whispered. 1 shot can punch through steel. Good thing I'm not planning to let them get a clear shot, Jake said. The assassins moved toward the garage in a tactical formation, professional and coordinated. They were clearly expecting an easy target, a stranded princess with no way to defend herself. They weren't expecting a human mechanic with a truck full of improvised weapons and a lifetime of desert survival skills. Jake waited until they were halfway between their ships and the garage. Then he pressed the trigger on a remote detonator he'd rigged up. The first gasoline trap exploded in a ball of flame, catching 2 of the assassins completely off guard. They weren't hurt badly, their armor protected them, but they were confused and disoriented. That's when Jake opened fire. His hunting rifle cracked 3 times in rapid succession, and while the bullets didn't penetrate their armor, the impact staggered them. 1 assassin turned and fired a plasma bolt toward Jake's position, the shot vaporizing a chunk of rock 10 feet to his left. We need to move, Jake said, already grabbing Lyra's hand and running to his second position. The assassins were angry now, shouting to each other in their own language. They split up, 2 heading toward Jake's last position while the other 2 circled around to flank them. But Jake had grown up playing cat and mouse with coyotes and jackrabbits in this desert. He knew every gully, every rock formation, every place to hide. He led Lyra through a narrow canyon, then doubled back. When 1 assassin came around a corner, Jake was waiting with his shotgun. At point-blank range, even alien armor couldn't completely absorb the impact. The assassin went down hard, his weapon flying from his hands. Lyra grabbed the plasma rifle without hesitation. Jake looked at her in surprise, but she just smiled grimly. I'm a princess, not helpless. She proved it a moment later when another assassin appeared. Her shot was precise, catching him in the chest plate and sending him sprawling. The remaining 2 assassins realized they'd underestimated their targets. They started to fall back toward their ships, calling for retreat. But Jake wasn't about to let them escape and come back with reinforcements. He'd positioned his truck for exactly this situation. He jumped in, Lyra diving into the passenger seat beside him, and he floored the accelerator. The old pickup roared across the desert, heading straight for the alien ships. "What are you doing?" Lyra shouted over the engine noise. "Making sure they can't follow us," Jake yelled back. The assassins saw him coming and fired their plasma weapons, but Jake swerved and weaved, using every bit of cover the terrain offered. One shot melted his side mirror clean off. Another burned a hole through his truck bed. But he kept going, adrenaline pumping through his veins. At the last second, Jake cranked the wheel hard and threw something out the window. A container of gasoline with a lit road flare taped to it. It smashed against one of the alien ships just as the remaining assassins reached it. The explosion wasn't huge, but it was enough. Their ship's fuel system ignited, and the craft went up in a spectacular fireball. The two surviving assassins stared in shock at their destroyed ship, then at the crazy human who'd just taken it out with what amounted to a firebomb in a bottle. They scrambled for their second ship and took off, apparently deciding that killing Lyra wasn't worth dealing with this insane mechanic. Jake brought the truck to a stop, breathing hard. Lyra looked at him with wide eyes, then suddenly started laughing. Not a nervous laugh, but a real, genuine laugh of relief and amazement. "You just fought off trained assassins with gasoline and hunting rifles," she said. "They're going to tell stories about this back home, and no one will believe them." Jake grinned, though his hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "Welcome to Earth. We might not have fancy technology, but we know how to fight." After the attack, Jake and Lyra knew they couldn't wait any longer. The assassins would report back and more would come. They had to leave Earth now, even though the ship was barely spaceworthy. The problem was that Lyra, despite being royalty, had limited piloting experience. She'd always traveled with trained crews. The ship's autopilot was damaged beyond repair, which meant someone would need to manually navigate through space. "I'll do it," Jake said, looking at the ship's control panel. Lyra stared at him. "Jake, you've never flown a spacecraft. You've never even been to space. I've flown small planes and I rebuilt half this ship. I know how it works now, probably better than most of your pilots." He sat in the pilot's seat, studying the controls. "Besides, you need to get home and I'm not letting you go alone. Not with those assassins still out there." Something in Lyra's chest tightened at his words. This human, who'd known her less than a week, was willing to leave his entire world behind to help her. She placed her hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly. "Truly." They launched at dawn. Jake's heart hammered as the ship lifted off, Earth falling away beneath them. The controls were responsive, more so than he expected. Within minutes, they broke through the atmosphere and stars stretched out in every direction. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Jake had ever experienced. The first 2 days went smoothly. Jake learned the rhythms of space travel, how to read the navigation charts, how to adjust their course for gravitational fields. Lyra taught him what she knew and he picked it up quickly. She found herself impressed not just by his intelligence, but by his calmness under pressure. He treated flying a starship the same way he treated fixing an engine, as a problem to be solved one step at a time. On the third day, disaster struck. They were passing through an asteroid field when the ship's navigation sensors failed. One moment they had a clear path plotted, the next they were flying blind through thousands of spinning rocks. "The sensors can't handle the interference from the asteroid minerals," Lyra said, frantically trying to reroute power. "We need to drop out of FTL and wait for them to recalibrate. It could take hours." "We don't have hours," Jake said, checking their timeline. "Those assassins could catch up." He studied the view screen, watching the asteroids tumble past. "I can fly us through manually." "That's insane. No one can navigate an asteroid field without sensors." Jake smiled. "I used to race motorcycles through desert canyons at night with just my headlights. Same principle, just bigger rocks." Before Lyra could protest, he took control. His hands moved over the controls with surprising confidence. He'd spent enough time studying the ship's systems to understand how each thruster responded. He flew by instinct and reflexes, dodging asteroids that came screaming out of the darkness. One passed so close it scraped against their shields, making the whole ship shudder. Lyra gripped her seat, watching in amazement as Jake weaved through the deadly field. Any Valerian pilot would have followed protocol, would have stopped and waited. But Jake saw the situation differently. He saw a path forward even if it was dangerous. 20 minutes later, they emerged from the asteroid field intact. "You're absolutely crazy," Lyra said, but she was smiling. "I prefer creative," Jake replied, adrenaline still pumping through his system. That night, as the ship traveled through the quiet darkness of space, They sat together in what passed for a living area. Jake had brought some Earth food with him, and he heated up 2 cans of soup on the ship's thermal unit. It wasn't fancy, but after days of Valerian ration bars, it tasted like heaven. "Can I ask you something?" Lyra said, holding the warm cup in her hands. "Shoot. Why did you really come? You could have sent me off alone. Gone back to your normal life." Jake was quiet for a moment, staring out at the stars. "I guess. I spent my whole life in that small town fixing cars and trucks. Same thing day after day. Then you crashed into my life, literally, and suddenly I had a chance to do something that mattered. To see things I'd only dreamed about." He looked at her. "Plus, I wasn't about to let you face those assassins alone. What kind of person would that make me?" Lyra felt something shift inside her. In her world, people helped others for political advantage, for favors owed, for status and power. But Jake helped because it was the right thing to do. It was such a simple concept, yet so rare in her experience. "Your people," she said quietly. "Humans? You're not what I expected." "What did you expect? We've observed Earth for years. Most species assume humans are primitive, maybe even barbaric. But you're not, are you? You're just different. You solve problems in ways no one else would think of. You don't give up. And you help people without expecting anything in return." Jake shrugged, a bit embarrassed. "We're just doing our best with what we've got." Another crisis came on day 5 when the FTL drive started overheating. The hybrid system Jake built was struggling with the extended journey. He spent 6 hours in the engine compartment, rerouting cooling systems and balancing power loads. Lyra worked beside him, handing him tools and following his instructions. They worked as a team, moving in sync like they'd been doing this for years instead of days. When they finally fixed the problem, they were both exhausted, covered in grease and sweat. Jake looked at Lyra and she looked back at him, and suddenly they both started laughing. They were millions of miles from Earth, flying through space in a half-broken ship, and somehow it felt right. "I'm glad you're here," Lyra said, her voice sincere. "Me too," Jake replied, and he meant it with his whole heart. 3 months later, the neutral medical station Asclepius Prime hosted an event that would be remembered across the galaxy for decades. The station orbited a dead moon in unclaimed space, chosen specifically because it belonged to no one. It was where diplomats met when they didn't want to meet. Where peace talks happened when nobody wanted to admit they were talking about peace. And today it was where Elder WRM Tharn would stand before the Galactic Medical Council. The chamber was massive, designed to accommodate hundreds of different species. Tharn stood in the center, his massive frame still bearing the crude but effective human repairs like badges of honor. The hull patches Rachel had slapped on his exoskeleton were still there, now incorporated into scar tissue. The splints she'd made from her armor plating had been removed, but the bones had healed around them in ways that Kaarthaxian physicians couldn't explain. 2 of his damaged limbs were regaining function, something Kaarthaxian medical doctrine had declared flatly impossible. Crushed limbs stayed crushed. That was the rule. Except apparently humans didn't care about rules. The council had demanded testimony about human medical capabilities. They wanted data, statistics, an explanation for how a single human medic with basic supplies had accomplished what their best physicians said couldn't be done. What they got instead changed everything. "I accepted death," Tharn began, his voice resonating through the chamber like distant thunder. Every species in the room had translation devices, and his words echoed in 100 different languages simultaneously. "My species honors death. We do not cling to life beyond our purpose. We do not waste resources on the fallen. When our time comes, we embrace it with dignity." His crest flared, the spines along his neck rising. In Kaarthaxian body language, it was a sign of deep emotion. Vulnerability even. But this human Rachel Webb, she did not accept my death. She looked at medical impossibility and said no. Just no. As if her refusal alone could change reality. He paused, and the chamber remained utterly silent. She fought for someone she did not know. Someone who could not repay her. Someone whose people had every reason to hate. My kind killed 20,000 of hers at Proxima Station. She was young enough that she probably knew some of them. And still she fought for me. A counselor from the Centauri delegation shifted uncomfortably. The Andorian representative made a clicking sound that translated as skepticism. But nobody interrupted. "I have hunted across stars," Tharn continued, his voice growing stronger. "I have commanded fleets in 7 major conflicts. I have ended civilizations that displeased my people. I have killed more beings than most of you will ever meet in your lifetimes." You let that sink in. "And I tell you, that is the most terrifying thing about humans. Not their weapons. Not their ships. Not their numbers. He lifted one of his partially healed limbs, showing the human-made brace that still supported the damaged joint. The metal was scratched and worn, clearly not designed for Carthaxian physiology, but it worked. This, he said. This is what terrifies me. They do not accept that anything is beyond saving. They do not understand the concept of acceptable losses. They will break every rule, defy every odd, and sacrifice their own well-being to drag you back from death's door. She had no training for my species. No proper equipment. No logical reason to try. But she tried anyway. Because to humans that is simply what you do. The recording went viral across every galactic network within hours. News stations played it on loop. Social media platforms exploded with commentary. Diplomatic channels buzzed with questions. What did this mean for human-Carthaxian relations? What did it mean for the war? What did it mean for how the galaxy viewed humanity? Rachel Webb, still on active duty aboard the UHMS Perseverance, watched the recording from her bunk. Her face burned with embarrassment as her fellow crew members kept congratulating her. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who'd done her job and was now getting way too much attention for it. Command had given her a medal and a promotion. She tried to refuse both. They'd insisted. But on the Carthaxian homeworld, something unprecedented occurred. The Council of Elders gathered in their ancient chamber, a place where they'd made decisions for thousands of years. These were beings who had never acknowledged another species' superiority in anything. Not in warfare. Not in technology. Not in culture. They considered themselves the apex of evolution, the pinnacle of what a species could become. They debated for 6 hours. Then they did something they'd never done before. They sent an official message to Human Admiralty requesting cultural and medical exchange programs. Not demanding. Requesting. The word choice alone sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Old Tharn, wearing his human-made mobility brace and walking better each day, began writing a manual in Galactic Standard. He worked on it every day, sometimes for hours, his large claws surprisingly delicate as they operated the text interface. The title read, Why Humans Make Death Uncomfortable, A Survivor's Account. The first line simply said, On the day I should have died with honor, a small human named Rachel Webb, carrying too much equipment and too little sense, decided that honor could wait. This is what I learned about humanity in the 12 hours that followed. The manual became required reading at every coalition medical facility within 6 months. Academies added it to their curriculum. Soldiers read it to understand their human allies better. Diplomats studied it to negotiate more effectively. And Rachel Webb, promoted to chief medical officer despite her gross violation of protocol, kept a small Carthaxian talisman on her desk. Tharn had sent it to her with a note written in careful halting English, My mates. She would want you to have it. You brought me home to tell her goodbye. That is a debt I cannot repay. Rachel never took another assignment without that talisman in her pocket. A reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to give up on someone, even when every logical reason says you should.